This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended for teachers of 4th grade social studies to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. This standard asks us to look at the process of rebuilding or reconstructing the South after the devastating Civil War, which is why this time period was called Reconstruction. But as you can see from the selected portions of Reconstruction the standard asks us to look at, we are primarily focusing on what effect the period following the end of the Civil War had on the African Americans or blacks that had been slaves and are now free. We will look at what rights the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were intended to establish or protect, and why they were necessary. We will also look at how the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was intended to help the newly freed slaves, and how despite all of these good intentions, the power structure in the South did not really change, and African Americans or blacks were unable to claim their hard-won rights. Additionally, we will look at how sharecropping was really no different than the slavery it replaced, and how many states created Jim Crow laws, which established legal segregation and essentially sanctioned discrimination. When looking at this standard, it may be useful to give our students a familiar frame of reference to help them understand the series of events, actions, and reactions that followed the end of the Civil War. Students will have difficulty remembering which Reconstruction amendments did what unless we can help them see them as a series of actions and reactions, each dependent on the other. The analogy students seem to relate to best is that of an argument with a sibling. Most of them will have had an argument with a sibling and will often say, if asked who won, that their sibling did. If then asked, did that make you change your mind about what you were arguing about in the first place? Did you come to see their side and agree that they were right? The answer is invariably, no, it did not. Well, the South felt the same way. They stopped fighting simply because it became obvious that they could not win, and they literally had nothing left with which to fight. Much the way a parent often is the one who stops the argument and essentially determines the winner. So despite the fact that the South lost and were forced to free their slaves, that doesn't mean they wanted to or agreed that they should. Once we establish that, it becomes easy to see that this entire standard revolves around the federal government trying to free the slaves and give them their constitutional rights, and the South resisting these efforts and trying to keep things as they were before the war. So let's look at the 13th Amendment. Many people have some misconceptions about the Emancipation Proclamation and how it is different from the 13th Amendment. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a part of his executive powers over armed conflict, and it was mostly intended as a way to get the Southern states to give up and rejoin the Union, as preserving the Union was his primary goal. It actually said that any Southern states that rejoined the Union by the deadline could keep their slaves, but if they did not, and the Union had to come in by force, then they would lose them. As none of the Southern states took him up on his offer, the proclamation did, in the end, wind up freeing all of the slaves. But the president cannot actually write laws, and so the Emancipation Proclamation was not a permanent solution. Only Congress can write laws, and so while the proclamation freed the slaves, it was the passage of the 13th Amendment that actually made slavery illegal and unconstitutional. But as we mentioned earlier, the South didn't really want this, and many of the white wealthy landowners that had power before the war were able to be in positions of power after the war, and came up with a way to virtually negate the 13th Amendment in the form of the Black Codes. While our standard does not hold students responsible for knowing about the Black Codes, it helps to understand why the 14th Amendment was necessary. The Black Codes were essentially local laws that said that while an African American or black was not a slave, they weren't really citizens either, because they came from Africa originally, despite the fact that all slaves at this time had been born in this country. And so they did not have the same rights as citizens. They were required to sign contracts with plantation owners to work for them for a full year, and if they quit before the year was up, they would get no wages at all and could even be arrested. In some states, they were even required to hold no job higher than farmer or servant. They also were forbidden to testify or bring charges against a white person, pretty much guaranteeing that they had no recourse to seek justice if mistreated. In a nutshell, the Black Codes returned African Americans or blacks in the South to slavery. Congress then sought to counteract this new denial of freedom for former slaves in the South by adopting the 14th Amendment, which they forced Southern states to ratify by requiring that they do so in order to gain readmittance into the Union. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and all of the rights that come with it, to anyone born in this country, regardless of where their ancestors were born or whether they had ever been slaves. Despite this amendment, states still had the power to establish requirements for voter registration, and so they denied African Americans or blacks the ability to register to vote. Congress then counteracted this new attempt to deny former slaves their right to vote by creating the 15th and final Reconstruction Amendment that says a state cannot deny anyone, or I should say any male, the right to vote based on race, color, or having been a slave. I'm sorry, ladies, they still could deny women the right to vote. One would think this would be enough, but many states soon found other ways to prevent African Americans or blacks from voting, such as literacy tests that only former slaves and their descendants had to take, or poll taxes that had to be paid in order to vote, or putting polling places in locations that required transportation, and more. While Congress attempted to establish equal rights for African Americans or blacks, they did not see any problem with the idea of separate but equal, and so many states responded with Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a derogatory characterization of an African American or black played by a white man in a minstrel show that became very popular by the name of Jim Crow. Jim Crow later came to be applied to a series of laws enacted that essentially legalized segregation, or the separation of the races. The lawmakers' justification was that both races would have the same stuff, just separately. The reality, however, was legalized discrimination. For example, both races could have a school, but all of the money went to the white school, and both races could have a bus station, but all of the money went to the white bus station, and so on. This is how we later end up with Rosa Parks being legally required to give up her seat to a white man. While Congress was at least able to attempt to address the inequalities in political power between whites and African Americans or blacks, there was little they could do about the economic inequalities. During the Civil War, it soon became apparent that freeing the slaves would not be enough. For centuries it had been illegal for slaves to be educated, or hold property, or seek training for any job other than what they had been purchased to do. They were wholly dependent on their masters for food, clothing, and shelter. So once they were freed, how would they get these things? And so Lincoln asked Congress to create the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, which was commonly referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau. This bureau was created to temporarily provide food, clothing, shelter, and medical care to the recently freed slaves and any refugees from the war. Recognizing that the former slaves would need a way to support themselves and had limited skills beyond the farming they had been allowed to do as slaves, the Bureau had intended to sell them, for a really low price, the abandoned and confiscated plantation lands of the former slaveholders. They were also empowered to set up schools to begin educating former slaves. Unfortunately, when Lincoln was assassinated and President Johnson took over, he pardoned the former landowners and allowed them to have their land back, which left former slaves with no real choice other than to become sharecroppers. A sharecropper basically rents the land from the landowner and pays the rent by sharing the crop they grow with the landowner. This may sound fair at first, but the landowner held all of the power. Sharecroppers were forced to purchase the supplies to farm and other household goods from the plantation store that charged highly inflated prices, forcing the sharecroppers to borrow money or purchase things on credit at exorbitant interest rates, because the only collateral they had was their crop itself. Not only that, but the landowner was the one who sold their crop and told them how much they got for it, and so there was no way for the sharecropper to negotiate for a better price or even to know if the price they got was honest. Most sharecroppers found themselves owing money at the end of the year and went further and further into debt to the landowner with no way to make changes to their condition. The Freedmen's Bureau's attempt to provide an education for former slaves was thwarted as well by the powerful white supremacist groups that quickly sprang up in the South. And while groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League were technically illegal, and so they hid their identities, their members were often those with power in the community. Many judges, police officers, mayors, and the like counted themselves as members of these groups. So despite having fought a war that pitted state against state, brother against brother, father against son, and nearly destroyed our fledgling nation, the freedoms promised to African Americans or blacks with the Union victory would take at least another century to come to fruition. It would not be until 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act that African Americans or blacks would be constitutionally guaranteed the same rights as whites in this country. That is all we have time for today. Thanks for watching. Here are some links to some helpful resources, as well as those used in the creation of this screencast.